I've been in where it hasn't been crammed and there's been a ton of people, so maybe it'll be a nice break. Or maybe this is a session people come to do their work, right, towards the end of the day. Anyway, my name's Rusty, like you can see, and I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction to PHP Data Objects and talk about my experience that I've had with them over the past year and kind of see if maybe you can get something that's helpful for you from this. I should mention this is the first time that I've given a talk at a computer conference, so if things don't go 100% smooth, then hopefully you'll be a little bit forgiving. I even had somebody at work said, "Oh, you've got to have one of these clickers," so they gave me one of these clickers to take. Okay, that makes it awesome, then I'll do it. Anyway, you probably all know why you're here, but in case you don't, there's a couple things that you need to know before we get into this presentation, is who it's for. Basically, it's for people who want to learn the basics and want to learn, start out learning PHP data objects. And throughout the presentation, the abbreviation for that is PDO, stands for PHP Data Objects. It's also for people who want to start using it in their code, so towards the end I'm going to have a little bit of, or a few examples to where maybe, that might be helpful to you. And the other thing is that if you have absolutely no knowledge of PHP or SQL, then this may not be the best place for it, because there's a few things I'm going to assume that you know, just really, really basic knowledge. So if you've got those, then that's good. And also, if you're a person that gets super excited and wants to do cartwheels when you think about connecting PHP to databases, then you're welcome here as well, like this little girl. OK, so let me tell you first what we're going to do. I don't think that we'll take up the whole time, so if you have questions, feel free to shout those out or raise your hand or whatever, and we'll go over them. But first, I want to give you my story and tell you how I came to programming in general and to PHP data objects specifically, because there's a very specific reason that I started using them over the past year, and they've been very helpful. So I kind of want you to see where I'm coming from so that you can understand why maybe I do some things the way that I do. Once I go over that, then I'm going to kind of cover PDO from a very high level. What is it? Who's it for? Where can you find documentation for it? Stuff like that. The 20,000-foot level, as I had a colleague that used to say all the time. After that, then I'll show you some real PHP code that has PDO examples in it, so you can use it if you'd like. I even pulled a piece of code of mine straight from a project I was working on and put in here without altering it at all, so that you can see an example with warts and all. Hopefully that doesn't embarrass me too awful much. And then towards the end, wrap up. Also give you a place where you can find these slides online, that you can get them right now, so you don't have to, if you don't want to take notes or you miss something, you can get all those later as well. OK, in case you haven't figured out, I'm a big fan of wolves. I like wolf pictures, so I threw a couple of those in here. Funny story is, a couple years ago I took my kids to Yellowstone National Park, and we were there for 4 days, and the whole time my daughter and my son's like, "We hope we see a wolf. We hope we see a wolf." And I said, "Well, good luck," right? We even went to a few places and tried to see them. Nothing. Very last day, we were driving out of Yellowstone Park on the road, going out. My kids are worn out. They've fallen asleep in the back seat. Right in front of us runs this gray wolf. I mean, so close I had to slam on my brakes so I didn't hit it. Woke up all my kids and said, "What was that?" And it was gone by that time, right? I said, "You missed it. A wolf ran right in front of us." First, they didn't believe me. Then they got angry that they missed it. And then my little daughter started crying. "That's all I wanted to see." I thought that would have been terrible if I'd hit it, because, I like them. What a way to gain notoriety by killing a wolf when you're in Yellowstone. But OK, so let me give you my history of programming. This is the very first computer that I ever owned, and the computer that I learned to program on. Anybody here ever used one of these? Commodore 64. In 1982, I was 11 years old, and I got one for Christmas, and I learned to program BASIC. This is that crappy old BASIC spaghetti code that had line numbers and everything. And I've been going to some of these other classes today, and they talk about, oh, there's this resurgence in functional programming. It's coming back. It's hot again. And I thought to myself, I wonder if BASIC will ever come back and be hot again. I kind of doubt it, especially the BASIC that had line numbers, like 10, print, you suck, and then 20, go to 10, and you just run all up and down the screen. Kind of things I did when I was 11, right? But I love programming, and so I followed that. So years later, this eventually led to a bachelor's degree, which I got in computer science from Weber State. Yay, Weber State. I've been programming the past 9 years as a full-time programmer, and almost all of that has been a full-time PHP programmer. So know if that's good or bad. I know I've run into a lot of people that absolutely despise PHP because there's lots of weird, crazy crap in PHP. I'll give it that, but I've enjoyed it overall. I've done some Java too, and then besides PHP, you know, you get all the stuff that goes along with it. You get HTML and XHTML and JavaScript and CSS and all that stuff. So I do some of that as well on the side. So the interesting part is that for the last 4 years, I've even got my UEN shirt on today. They're like, oh, wear your UEN shirt so you can make people aware of us. Okay. So the last 4 years I've been working for the Utah Education Network up on the campus of the University of Utah. And my job, surprise, surprise, is PHP programmer. It's pretty much all that I do. So let me tell you how I got into PDO then, and what prompted this whole thing. When I started at UEN, what I got was UEN handles several websites. They handle about 15 or so that they code and create and maintain and get rid of and everything. So I inherited about 15 websites. Some of them were kind of small. Some of them were kind of big. Like the UEN one's pretty big, several thousand files. You know, lots of people visiting all the time. But the one thing that I inherited was out of all these 15 to 20 websites, 4 of them used a framework, a horribly outdated, like 7-year-old version of CodeIgniter, and the rest of them were just PHP files, you know, just plain old PHP files, no sort of framework or anything on them, which is okay. I can do that. The guy that was before me, he was really a front-end type of guy, and so he was one of those people that said, hey, well, let's use PHP because then I can code up all the stuff and I can make our HTML look cool. And they said, okay. He was the first programmer, and so I came back in. And which is fine. I can go through all that and work on that. That's okay. But I found 2 problems as I was looking through this code. And the first problem is that in the main UEN website, okay, we're talking thousands of files, he had hard-coded in every file his connection to MySQL. So in every file, it would start out a bunch of HTML, and then in the middle, he'd say, connect to MySQL, get this result set back, and then he would iterate through it, doing HTML stuff, and then he would close the connection, be done. Okay, it worked great. So the big problem started when, about a year or 2 ago, I learned that these functions that he was using in all 739 files, because I counted them, he was using this MySQL library to connect to the database. And if you've done any coding in PHP, you know it was very popular. It had things. That's why I put the X on here, because there was the MySQL_connect function. That's right. That's how you connect the database. There was the MySQL_query function. There's all these functions, and then there was MySQL_close. That's what he did in all of them, which again is okay. It worked, except that I found out that this function of libraries, or this library functions, excuse me, was being deprecated, meaning that it was going to go away in a future version of PHP. And when I found that out, I was like, oh, crap. Maybe I can have it hold out long enough until I leave UEN, because I did not want to go through 700+ files and change all that by hand. And I've since found out that PHP 7, these libraries are going away. So if you're using these in your project and you want to upgrade to PHP 7, you've got to get them out or they're not going to be there. So that was the first problem. The second problem is that I work in a large enough organization that all I get to do is program. And all I do is program in PHP. All day, every day, I've got hundreds of things to do, you know, stuff to keep me busy all the time. So we have a separate department that handles all our networking stuff. We have a database administrator that handles all our database stuff. Well, unbeknownst to me, they had gotten together and decided they did not like MySQL, which was the database that all of our websites used. And they said, we're getting rid of that. We're going to switch to Postgres. Okay, I wish you'd have told me that like a long time ago. But anyway, this ended up being my second problem. So the first problem was that I had all these libraries that were deprecated. They were going to go away. The second one was our admin guy said, hey, we're going to yank MySQL out from under you. And so I thought, well, maybe there's some way I can do something that will kind of take care of both problems at the same time. So I thought, hey, maybe I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, just where the picture comes from. I definitely wouldn't kill those birds, but it's kind of the saying as it goes. OK, so now you've got my story. Perhaps you can see where I'm coming from. Let's start out with a look at PHP Data Objects, just a really high-level overview of what they are. And that's the first question. What is PDO, or what are PHP Data Objects? Well, if we get on the php.net website, they have a really good definition. says PHP Data Object extension defines a lightweight, consistent interface for accessing databases in PHP. Seems straightforward enough, just a way to connect your database and do stuff with your database. But let me point out what it is and what it isn't, because I think this is a kind of a crucial point. The first one, and this is the only "is" on the slide, is PDO is a data access abstraction layer. So abstraction, I'm sure you all know, means just kind of a way to hide things, right? Hide it behind whatever. So PDO, when they give this statement here, it means that it is abstracting your connecting to the database part. So in theory, you should be able to write the same code and not care how your application connects to the database. That part is abstracted. What PDO is not, however, is not a database abstraction layer. It does not try to hide the fact that you're using a database, that you're connecting to it, you're getting stuff back from it. So a little bit of a difference there. And one good way to illustrate that is that PDO is not an ORM, which stands for Object Relation Mapping System. So I don't have much experience with ORMs in PHP, but I have used some in Java. I used Hibernate for a while. And basically, this is where you can put annotations in your code, and you can have it automatically connect to the database and get stuff, and you pretty much don't ever have to know that it's connecting to the database or doing anything, right? Cool in its own right, but PDO is not an ORM, so you need to get that out of the way right at the beginning. PDO does not rewrite your SQL. If you hate SQL and you hate writing it, you're still going to hate it after you implement PDO, because you still have to write SQL statements. And PDO does not come up with any new cool features that SQL, standard SQL is missing, and so they thought they'd put on top of. Doesn't do that. Remember, it's a data access abstraction layer, so just basically is abstracting the fact that you're connecting to and how you interact with your database. Okay, so that kind of sums up what it is, what it isn't. The next question would be, why do you even want to use PDO? What is it good for? Why are you even here in this classroom with lots of room to stretch out? Well, you could be in my situation where your database administrator says, guess what? We're going to change the database on you. In theory, and we'll talk about this towards the end, switching the back-end databases should be relatively easy. It's not 100% foolproof, which we'll talk about, but if you know you're going to be changing databases, it'll make your life a lot easier. Probably the biggest reason I know of that people want to use or like to use PDO is because it has this feature called prepared statements. And we will go into this more later as well. Basically, prepared statements are you tell the PDO where your variables are going to go in the SQL code, and then you can run that code over and over again, just substituting in the variables. The nice thing about that is that if you use prepared statements, it's a great way to help prevent SQL injection. Not 100% injection proof, but it's another layer of security that does a pretty good job keeping people out of the database using SQL injection. If you're going to be rewriting code, and you know that it uses a MySQL function or a MySQLi function or some of these libraries in PHP where they are very database specific, maybe you could rewrite it and have it use PDO. If you are very much a fan of object-oriented programming, which seems like PHP is really going that way lately, hasn't always been. I mean, you can write procedural code in PHP if you like, but if you prefer the object-oriented way of doing things, then PDO is great. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you can have a class, or you can create an object. You can use the properties and the methods on that. Also, if you use PDOs, you can put things inside of a try-catch block, so you can try code, and if it throws an error, then you can catch it and handle it gracefully. You can't always do that with some of those other functions, but you can with PDO. And finally, if you're one of the 10 million people in the world that's writing your own PHP framework, you've got to have some way to connect to the database, right? So this might be a good way to do it. Okay, there's some reasons why you'd want to use it. So let's look at some of the very first steps, getting our feet wet with PDO. PDO has been enabled and turned on in PHP ever since version 5.1. So if you have anything above that, you have PDO, unless you specifically compiled it and stripped it out or something like that. The other thing that I found very helpful over the past year is that the documentation for PDO on the PHP website is really good. Here's the link to it, and I want to pull up this website. Let's see if I can get it to work here. Here's the PHP.NET website, and here is the section about PHP Data Objects. And I've got the URL there, but if you don't know, you can always just go over here to this search box, and let me use this cool feature that somebody told me about. Oh, sorry, doesn't work. I'll use this other cool feature that somebody told me about. Oh yeah, look at that. So you can always come over here to this search box, type in PDO, and this is the main overview page for PDO. And as you can see on there, it gives you an introduction. It talks about installing, configuring, kind of goes over some of the theory or how PDO handles things, and then it has class documentation down below. But this I found to be excellent, very useful when you're writing code, and also a lot of other people have gone in here, and at the bottom of most pages they have comments where people say, hey, I've tried this, doesn't work, or do it this way, or whatever. So if you've never been to the PHP documentation, there you go. Great resource. Does anybody use that PHP.NET website very much? Okay, great. Okay, so you guys, yeah, that's right. So let's talk about the main classes in PDO then. There are 3 of them that are very important. And the very first one is just the plain old or regular Pdo class. And what is that? Again, according to PHP.NET, it represents a connection between PHP and the database server. Usually, I found in my own code that this is the only object that you have to actually instantiate. You know, you'll say DBH or your database handler, whatever, equals new PDO. And I'll go over an example of that here in just a minute. But this is the main one. So this gives you your connection to the database and allows you a way to work with stuff in there. The next one is the Pdo Statement. What is this? Represents a prepared statement. And after that statement runs against the database, it represents the result set that comes back as well. So if I want to get an array of objects out of the database, right, then I would query the database, and whatever comes back is a Pdo Statement object. And finally, the third one that you use a lot, or that is useful, is the Pdo Exception Class. And this pretty much, or it sounds like, it's when PHP is going to throw an error, it throws a Pdo exception. The thing to know about this is that you are not supposed to use, or excuse me, you're not supposed to throw Pdo exceptions in your own code. You're only supposed to catch them and then handle the error gracefully. Okay, so those are the 3 main sections of PDO. A couple other important ideas when you're talking about PDO is this concept of Pdo Drivers. So I'm sure nowadays most people know what drivers are, but we'll go over it just a little bit. Drivers are a way for the Pdo class to implement Pdo specifically for the database that you're using. So for example, if you're using MySQL, you have to tell Pdo to use the MySQL driver. Or if you're using Postgres or Microsoft SQL Server, this, whatever, you want to tell it which driver to use. Back on here, if you scroll down at the very bottom, it gives you a great list right here. So you can probably all see that, but right over here it gives you a list of all the drivers that you can use. So it's got even some kind of obscure ones that I've never even used, but all the big ones are there. So if you have one of these databases, then you've already got a driver that you can use with PDO. Okay, so keep that in mind, Pdo drivers. The other important thing to know about PDO, which we've mentioned just a little bit, is prepared statements, that idea of prepared statements. And I think I mentioned that this is probably the #1 reason that I know that most people want to use PDO or switch to PDO. Prepared statements really are very nice once you get the hang of them. Prepared statements basically are just what it says, a kind of compiled template. You say, here's the SQL, but in this spot and this spot, we're going to be substituting variables, and so deal with them. And PDO does. That's kind of the cool thing, is that you can stick these variables or these parameters in the code, and it will automatically do things like escape them or correctly handle integers or the data type or whatever it is. The other cool thing about prepared statements is that you can write a prepared statement once in your code, and then if you're going to use that same SQL over and over again, but you just want to substitute out the variables, you can do that, and this saves a ton of space, a ton of time, and runs a lot faster too. I have discovered. But my favorite thing is that you do not need to escape or otherwise quote strings that you put into the variables in PDO. So this helps defend against SQL injection. Now why is that, you say? Because if you've used any of these other libraries like the MySQL library or whatever, you'll know that before you ever take data that comes from a user and put it right into the SQL string that you're sending to your database, you want to run something like real escape string on it, right? So it goes through and slashes and it quotes and it takes out all the dangerous characters. Well, in PDO, since you have earlier told it what your SQL statement is and where the variables are going to be, it knows that anything that you put in those spots are variables, right? So it will handle those automatically. If it's a string, it'll say, okay, go through and backslash or quote or whatever. If it's an integer, it does other stuff. So you don't need to worry about putting quotes or backslashes in anywhere, which is great. Okay. Yes?
Do you know you say it helps defense. What are the exceptions that you need to watch out for?
Okay, so your question is, I'm telling you that it helps a lot to defend against SQL, but what are the exceptions? So I'll talk about this a little bit later on, but basically if someone's entering input onto your site and you put that inside of a PHP variable, and then you stick the PHP variable right in the SQL code without using the place markers, which we'll talk about here in a second, it still could be problematic because you're not going through the proper channels that PDO expects. So that's one example, which I've been burned on before. So cool, good. And did somebody else have a question too?
On the prepared statements, like with MySQL, with the NO database, you can do transactions.
Yeah.
Do they allow you to do transactions on prepared statements?
Do PDO allow you to do transactions? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Yes, they do. If your database supports transactions, then PDO has a certain library, certain set of methods that you can use that will facilitate transactions. If your underlying database does not support transactions, remember, it's not a magic thing, right? It's not going to do something that your database doesn't do. But if it does support transactions, then yeah, you can use it. And I actually have a slide later on about that too. So good point. Okay. Well, let's jump into how we would use PDO. I picked that picture because I thought it was kind of scary, but using PDOs isn't too scary, hopefully. Here are the three most common things, I think, that you do when you connect to a database. Right? First, you got to get a connection. Eventually, you got to close it, or you should close it. And third is you handle errors that come up. So let me make sure you can see that. Those are images I wanted to get some kind of good ones. So look at that very top one where you connect. It's as simple as saying, hey, my database handler, which is the $dbh, equals new PDO. And then inside there, you're going to have three parameters. That first parameter is what's called a data source name. And it's just a string that's composed itself of three things. The very first thing right before that, before the colon, let's see if I can, let's see if I can do this. Whoops. I'm messing things up. Hold on. Oh, look at that. So right over here, this part right there, where it says MySQL : that is where you're indicating which driver PDO needs to use to connect your database, because we're connecting to a MySQL one. The second part, you need to tell it what your host is, where your database is located, and then you need to tell what the name of the database is. And then the other two parameters, you need to pass in a username and a password so that you can connect to it. That's as simple as it is for connecting, which isn't too bad. And we'll go over later what happens if you change your database. Really, the only thing that would change is that first part right there. So let's say you connect to a database, you use it, and then you want to close it. That is pretty simple as well. All you do is you set your database handle to null, and that does it. And you may think, well, that seems kind of, a roundabout way to go about it. But when you set it to null, what you're telling PHP is to call the destructor on the object right, which goes in and closes the connection and everything like that. So very simple way to close your connections. Works out pretty good. And then at the bottom there is kind of a try-catch block where you would catch errors. So for example, inside the try, someone's trying to connect to the database, do a very simple query. And if any errors are raised, then down below, this person, prints error and then dies. But you could handle that a lot of other ways. For example, send out an email, write it to your log file, give the user some sort of graceful error message so it doesn't completely die on them. But that's how you use the error handling. Pretty much like any other object-oriented error handling. So here's some examples. I've got a few examples. This one is just reading data, and I'm going to use prepared statements. And these two blocks do exactly the same thing, but they go about them in different ways just because you can do things a little bit differently in using PDO. So let's look at that first one, using named placeholders. So you can see that very first line does just what we did before. Or excuse me, I'm sorry. This is assuming that you've already connected to the database, that you have your database handler. So now what you're doing is you're going to prepare it. And this is the part where you put in your SQL code. See, it says select name and color and calories from fruit where calories equals blah, blah, blah. So these are the parts that you really want to pay attention to right there and that one right there. So what you're doing is you're saying inside this code, right at that spot where there's a colon and there's calories, that is where the first variable is going to go. And right where it says colon color, that's where our second variable is going to go. And then next you do this thing called bind parameters. And what that means is that you take a value that you're going to want to insert in, right, is the variable, and you're telling PDO, hey, for the variable up there that's called calories, insert the value 150. And then for the variable that's called color, insert the string red. And then that very last one says, OK, now execute it. Now down below, it does the same thing, but this has what's called question mark placeholders. So you can see in the SQL down there, instead of having those colon with the label name, you can just put in question marks. But now, when you want to bind the parameters, you kind of got to tell it which one to bind to, right? So that's down below where it says bind parameter 1, and then it says use the value that comes from the variable calories. And then these two down below, I've added in a couple extra little things so you can see there's a lot more going on. But so in that first one, it's telling PDO that this value that's coming in here is an integer. If it's anything else, deal with it or handle it or fail or something, but it's got to be an integer. And then that second bind parameter statement below it has not only the type in there. This one says that a string is coming in, but it also says, it can't be longer than 12 characters long. If it is, then raise an error. And finally, you can run the execute statement off that as well. So 2 different ways to go about it. Use different placeholders, or you can put different parameters inside your bind parameter. OK, you.
What shows up if you don't bind the parameters? Is it default null, or just skip over it?
So that's a good question. I don't know for sure, but I believe that it spews out an ugly error. But I'm not 100% sure. I don't think so.
No,
does anybody know?
Bind it. I need to get a bind error.
OK, all right. OK, and you.
So is it sensitive to what type of parameter and where it is in the statement, or can you use, for example, the table name as vary that?
You're talking about like right here where you put these variables inside the SQL?
Yeah, like can you use the table name?
Could you put that in the from? Or in
Or does it make sure that it's like is it checked for its location?
That's a good question. Well, I think that it checks for the location. The problem that I had before is I've tried to put a variable in for the table name, right, and it has not liked it. So I don't know if I was doing it wrong or what, but if I put them in different places before, I've had problems with that. So usually it's right there. But
There's other ways to handle that. I was just curious if that.
Yeah, honestly don't know all of that either. Was there somebody else that had something? OK, so there's 2 examples of reading data. Let's look at an example of inserting data using prepared statements. So this one I'm doing something a little different as well. If you don't like the idea of putting your variable down there in a separate bind parameter statement, what you can do that I found very useful is you can create an array, and you can build up your variables in that array. Then when you run the execute statement, you can just pass it that array, and it will automatically go through and bind all those parameters for you. But how does that work? When you're creating your array, which I've just called bind array, that the name of the element right there, first name, has to match exactly the name of your named placeholder down here. That's how it knows which one to put where. Again, then you would prepare it, but this time you don't have to run those bind parameter statements and explicitly bind the variable to it. You just do execute, and you pass in that array, and it goes through and automatically does it for you. And the other thing this one is doing, just to show you some of the other stuff, is that if you want to get the last insert ID, you can do that by running this method right after you run the SQL code. Did somebody have something over here? Sorry, I'm seeing people hold up their hands all over, I thought. OK, so that's another way to go about it. What if you want to delete data? Well, one thing that's kind of nice with PDO is that you don't always have to use prepared statements. You can just put raw SQL in there exactly like it is. So in this example, I'm running a different method. So I'm running this one right here that's just called exec. Let me back up a slide and show you how it was different from before. I was running one called execute. This time I'm running exec, and I'm just saying delete from wherever. And this doesn't return a data set. What it does is it returns a number that represents the number of rows that were affected. So that's why that count variable is on front. And then after I could do something like print off how many rows were deleted. Well, that's all fine and cool, but let's see what the difference between exec and execute are, okay? Because this one burned me several times. Exec is a method of the Pdo class. Remember, the Pdo class is the one that initially establishes the connection with your database, so it's a method in there. This one executes an SQL statement and returns the number of affected rows. That's pretty much what it does. This execute method, that's a method for the Pdo Statement class. And the statement class, if you remember, is what you get back after you connect to the database and run some sort of query against it. This one executes a prepared statement, and then it returns true or false. Okay, it's not going to return. I think I said it wrong before. It's not going to return a data set. I would have to run another method, which I'll show you here in a minute, that will return the data set. But they do return different things. So one of them sends back the number of affected rows. Another one sends back a true false, meaning yes, it worked, or no, it didn't work. OK, so here's the code that I took straight from my project and put in here, because this is a real example and it works, and I've been using it for a while. So it may not be the prettiest, but it does what I want. And this is kind of putting everything together. So what I had done is I had created kind of my own abstract class to connect to the database. Basically, I've got the same things I showed you earlier. It just went in and says create a new PDO connection. I had that inside of a try-catch block so that if there was an error raised, I can handle it, and then it returns it. So that's what this very first part right up there is doing. Right in the middle, I have some code because I'm getting a list of meetings for today out of the database. And so the way that they were stored in there, I just kind of used some PHP to create code for times. The interesting stuff comes down here towards the bottom. That's my SQL statement. And then you can see that I'm using the execute statement right there. And then the very next thing is I am telling it to fetch everything. So I'm not sure if I was explaining this very well. This execute statement right there, once I run that, it comes back with a true or false, right? So I'm assuming it's coming back with a true that says, OK, I've executed your statement. Now that it's executed, I have to run some sort of fetch on it. This one I'm saying fetch every record that you got and put it in an associative array, because that's what I'm going to be returning to my program. Then I close it out, and then I return it. So this is code that I've used for a while. Seems to be working good, even if it is ugly in some places. Any questions about any of that?
So if you weren't sure, you would just check if that was true or false, or would you put it in a try-catch block?
You're talking about this part right here where it says execute and it returns a true or false? Yeah, I'm assuming that you'd have to check for it. It's kind of funny because I never had a problem with this, and it wasn't until preparing this presentation that I'm like, oh my gosh, that returns a true or false. I didn't even know it. So yeah, I would imagine that you would get an error, but again, it's another thing that I haven't heard. Yes, yeah, that's another thing I noticed when I putting this in there. I was kind of hoping no one would catch that, but yeah, that is something else I would do. I'd do it over again. There's a couple things to watch out for that have burned me greatly. And one of them is if you're using this like for your SQL statement. If you're using like, percent, and then some word and percent, oh my gosh, this gave me so much grief. So here's the code that I eventually ended up using. I've since found that there's a couple other ways you can do it. But the big point on this is that, well, let me tell you what this is doing. We have a website where we've got a list of all these resources, right? And every resource has a name and it has a description. And there are thousands of them. So this is a very simple search where someone comes to it and they say, hey, show me all the resources for math. So they just type in the word math. So what I wanted to do was to get everything that had the word math in the title or math in the description. That's all this does. So what I found out, the easiest way to go about this is to use the question mark placeholders. right there. And then up here, when you're building your variables, that is where you would put the percent sign in. And yeah, seems simple enough now, but that was like 6 hours of banging my head against the desk one day to figure that out. So there's some other ways. So there's a few little things that are a little bit different, especially if you're used to writing your own SQL code like straight in, and you say, you know, like, percent, keyword, or whatever. Then you've got to do a few things a little bit different. Or if you're coming from that MySQL library and you're used to doing things that way, you got to change things up just a little bit. But once I got used to it, it seemed
so you're saying
okay.
You had like space percent question mark percent down in the SQL query, it was barfing? Like you had percent?
Yes. So the first time that I did it down here, instead of using, or right there where the question mark was, I was putting question mark inside it, single quote, question mark, single quote. That didn't work. Then I tried question or single quote, percent sign, question mark, percent sign, single quote. That was barfing out. Anyway, I found out if you put them up here in the variable that you pass in, that it seemed to like them better that way. So that's one big gotcha that burned me. Here's something that you were bringing up, support for transactions. I don't want to go over this too in depth, but if your database supports transactions, then there are PDO methods that will help you run transactions. And in case you don't know, transactions are just saving up, I mean, very basically, they're saving up a bunch of SQL queries. Then you put a lock on the database, you run all those queries. If they worked, good, then you take the lock off and you let them know. If you lock it and then run them and something goes wrong in the middle, then instead of committing them all, you roll them all back and you unlock the database. That's basically what a transaction is. And so here's some code that does transactions. And you can see that Pdo class has some things like this begin transaction right there. And then you put the execute in, and then you do commit. This is all in a try-catch block, so if anything goes wrong, then it's going to roll it back and do something with the error message that comes through. So you can do transactions. But again, if your backend database doesn't support transactions and you try doing this, it's going to die on you. It's going to throw an error. The other one comes to changing your database, and this is something, unfortunately, I had to deal with. So in theory, right, if you're using PDOs, all you have to do is go into that part where you say new PDO and you put that connection string in. You just change the driver from MySQL to Postgres or to IBM or whatever, and you're done. Walk away, right? Not quite so easy, because guess what? Well, let me show you an example of what that is. I think you guys got it, but this is what it is if you have MySQL. This is what it would be if you want to use the Postgres driver. And all that's changing is that part, that very first part right before the colon right there. So that's the theory. Okay, but something that burned me that I didn't even realize is that I used to love to use that MySQL specific keyword that was called replace into. So I found this a few years ago and thought, this is cool, because if I'm trying to insert something into the database, instead of going and just searching for it and then see if it's there or not, and then if it isn't, do an insert. If it is, just do an update. I can use this MySQL thing called replace into, and it does it for me. This is awesome. So I ran this. Except that when I tried to switch over to Postgres, it didn't like that very much, because, unbeknownst to me, that is a MySQL specific thing. Now you may say, how the crap do we know what is MySQL specific? Well, if you go to the documentation for your database, for example, this one for the MySQL part, and let me pull this up right here. Ta-da! There is a section that says, look, MySQL differences from standard SQL. And there's a whole bunch of things there that if you're using that in your PDO statements and you change your database that doesn't support them, it will cause you loads of grief. So just be aware that there are some things like that don't go across very well. Anybody else been burned by this specific stuff before? You have too?
The one that burned me is I had to switch from MySQL to SQL Server, and the insert ID doesn't work on the SQL Server PDO.
The insert ID was the one that's giving you grief? Okay. Did you figure that out quickly, or was it like an excruciating, painful time?
I think it took me about a half an hour. That's not too bad. It doesn't take me a long
Yeah,
time.
okay.
Something's just not working here.
Okay, so the whole idea, really, when you think about it, behind PDO is that you want to abstract your connection to the database. So one way to do that is to use standard SQL the whole way through, which you don't have to. Obviously, it doesn't enforce it, but when you try to, if you try to change, then that will burn you.
What about, question?
Yes?
What about things like dates, where different databases
Oh, do you have to change something so that it's using the correct format for the database? I don't know. I haven't run across that problem yet, I should say. I'm sure that I might. Because the way that I've been doing it, kind of like I showed in my code before, is I was using PHP to construct the date and then format it in the format that I knew the database needed, right? I can imagine, though, that could be a problem to watch out for, but I haven't run into it yet.
Okay, and can you just say it's a date field in the database, return it as a PHP date? That would probably take care of it.
It might. I kind of don't think so, but it might, and I haven't tried that. So, okay. In the last 10 minutes or so that I have here, is that right? We go till 10:02? Okay. I was going to talk about, hey, if you're using a framework, then you can go in and you can configure it to use PDO. But then I'm like, why would you care how your framework connects a database? And the vast majority of the time, you would not care. Why? Because frameworks, a lot of them anyway, abstract out that database connection layer anyway in the first place. Especially if they're using ORM. So if they're using something like Doctrine or whatever, then they're automatically abstracting it. So I don't know why you'd care. But if you do care, I did find that the very latest version of CodeIgniter, which is the one that I use, so this is the one that I know the most about, they just barely came out with version 3.0, just like within the last month or so. They actually have an option when you're setting your configuration for how it connects to the database. You can say, connect with that MySQL library that's going away. If you want, you can say connect with the MySQL I library, or you can say connect using PDO. Does that matter? Not really, because everything that you get back looks exactly the same for using that framework anyway. Other than if you tried to upgrade to PHP 7 and you were using that MySQL library, you will have problems. So if this is really of concern for you, then I would say check your framework documentation, whatever one you're using, and they might give you different ways to connect to a database or to do it like you want. Okay, in the last few minutes here, let me just wrap up my story when working at UEN. So when I found out that I had 739 files that I had to fix, it took me an entire year of doing this, going through and fixing them, and it was so freaking monotonous. So what I did is I'd work on a project most of the day, and I'm one of those people that in the morning I've got all the energy right, and as the day goes on, I kind of, so I'd wait till towards the end of the day when I was kind of, was burnt out on what I was doing, and I would open up these files one by one. And I think I said already, I abstracted out that connection class. So I would go into these files, and I'd find the part where it said connect to MySQL, and I would just reference it back to this one class. So now that I've gone through them, they all use one method to connect. Hopefully when I switch over to Postgres, I can just point them all to that. So that took a long time. But what's the upside? I feel that now I have better, non-deprecated, more secure, uncoupled, object-oriented code for database connections, if that matters. I like it better. Plus, I got to know my code a whole lot better, so that's one thing. So maybe I'll be back next year telling you all the problems that I had as I tried to switch from MySQL to Postgres. I hope not, but it is possible. If you like PDO and you want to start using it or you want to learn more about it, I cannot emphasize enough PHP's own documentation about it I found to be super helpful, especially if you're used to using PHP's documentation. It was great. Another good article is this one on Creative Blog where the guy just goes over very simply why or how you would use PDO. And I took some of my ideas off there. There are also some books. So like on Amazon, two really good ones I found, Learning PHP Data Objects and this Pdo Quick Start. Both seem to be pretty good. Finally, I should have put this in earlier, but all the pictures that I got today came from Flickr, and they were all Creative Commons license, and there they are. And finally, the last slide. If you have time, go to JoinedIn, and you can rate or give feedback about this presentation. If you would like to get these slides, that's my own website right there, and they are up right now. You can get them either as a PowerPoint or as a PDF. And that pretty much sums it up. Does anybody have any question or any comment? We got about 5 minutes if you want to bring anything up. Yeah?
You said it was lightweight. Have you noticed or read about any kind of performance issues with going with this version over another?
I have not noticed any type of performance hit at all. I haven't really checked, though, all that much. Because my mindset when doing this was, OK, before switching to PDO, this page loads reasonably fast. After switching to PDO, it still loads reasonably fast. So I didn't really run timers or anything on it, but I haven't noticed any slowdown at all, that's for sure. So, yeah.
So if you had code was running with CodeIgniter, is there a reason why you chose not to use the built-in active record?
I do use the built-in active record. So on my, I don't think I mentioned this, but on my projects that use CodeIgniter, I didn't really care. I didn't do anything with the PDO on them, right? Other than I went in to make sure that in my configuration settings they were not using that MySQL one anymore. I changed them all to MySQLi. But no, I left those alone. So sorry, I should have mentioned that. I didn't do anything with those. It was just the ones that were the homegrown PHP files that I went in and changed, yeah. No. Which is one advantage to using a framework, right? I mean, stuff like that, hopefully. There's other things that can drive you crazy with frameworks, but there you go. Anything else? Is anybody here using PHP Data Objects right now, or you are? How about, do you guys have good experiences, bad experiences, or been all right? I've been pretty happy.
I had to figure out the SQL Server one didn't honor the insert ID stuff.
Oh yeah, once you figure out that non-standard SQL. Okay, yeah. Since I've moved over and gotten used to it, I've liked PDO a lot better, actually. Once you get used to using it, it turns out pretty nice. So, okay, that's it. A few minutes early, you guys can go to your next classes. Thank you.